finishing up with Jackie Panasuik, who is talking about successful delivery and beyond. Jackie is in America. She's the Chief of Staff for Deloitte Consulting's US Investment Management and Real Estate practice. In her past leadership roles, she has been focused on strategic digital transformation initiatives, and I see she has had global delivery leadership roles in the USA, Hungary, India, Hong Kong, and Brazil. So a very impressive track record there. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and very wise words indeed already from Alan and Francis, so thank you for that. So without further credentializing myself, I'd love to share a few fun facts. So I guess maybe 500 points if you can guess the mountain range there behind me and my husband. 1,000 points if you've ever spent the night in a rooftop tent. And 2,000 points if you know what that Nickelodeon looking like thingamajig is there. That occupies my morning every weekday. So feel free to share some commentary there in the chat. I'll wait maybe a few seconds as I just introduce myself a little bit more. But indeed, I have spent my career at Deloitte Consulting. I was in client service for most of that, really for the last 10 to 15 years prior to transitioning to an internal role. I currently serve as the Chief of Staff for a sliver of our practice, the investment management and real estate space within financial services. I have degrees in management from Boston College and Stanford School of Business. And as Simon said, I've held global delivery roles, which means I've really worked in a delivery leadership role, really delivering global transformation for B2B and B2C organizations, collaborating with US, EU, and Asia Pac, and most importantly, offshore delivery. That being said, I am not technical. So the context of my chat will be mostly talking about product management and what it takes to really bring product design and solution delivery to life. So we'll really be leaning into product management and using Agile and really what Agile versus waterfall delivery means. I understand that this audience really goes across the whole spectrum of experience. Some of you, I'm sure, are a little bit more tenured than others, so I'll try my best to explain those TLAs, three-letter acronyms that all of us consultants love. But please feel free to put in the chat if something looks a little unfamiliar. But I am going to cover what Agile delivery is, everything from discovery to sprinting and releasing your product into a production environment. Who are the key players on what's known as the Scrum team? What are the ceremonies that team involves itself in? Ceremonies is just another fancy word for meetings. What does successful product ownership really look like? So we're here to talk about successful delivery, not adequate delivery. And time permitting, I know, those in India and Sri Lanka, it's already midnight. So if we have time, I'll just touch on some of, what success looks like in a globally distributed team, and also what measuring success looks like. And of course, if we don't get to all your questions along the way, hopefully we'll have just a few minutes for those toward the end. So for those who didn't have a thought, the answers and all those bonus points, those are the Canadian Rockies in the background. If you haven't had a chance to spend the night in a rooftop tent, highly recommended. They keep you away from any bears that might be lingering at your campsite. And that is an Orange Theory logo. So if you haven't gotten your well-being act together in this global pandemic, I've done over 600 classes and dropped 30 pounds. So highly recommended. Okay, so without further ado, here is my icebreaker for you. So using the chat box, we've all gotten used to it. Rooftops, yes, tents attached to cars, to trucks or big cars. Yes, thank you, Antonio. So please signal the emoji that best represents your experience with product or solution delivery. So again, just trying to get a sense of who's here, what's been your experience. So do you know what I'm about to tell you? Do you even need to be here for the next 20 minutes, or can you multitask? I'll give you a couple of seconds to chime in. Awesome. So maybe I'll just call on John and Paul to help me deliver some of these key messages. I'll admit it has been a couple of years now since I've been behind the helm. Good stuff. Well, thank you for everybody who is here with us this evening. Let's keep going. So for those of you who have been in a delivery role, you may or may not have experience with Agile. Some of you may have been on projects that followed a more traditional or waterfall approach. So in order to embrace Agile, we often challenge our clients to go through a very simple mental exercise, because it does indeed require a shift in your thinking. So I'll challenge y'all to just take 15 seconds to indulge me in a simple exercise. Now, I know many of us are not commuting these days, but bear with me. So here's Lisa. Lisa is in need of transportation from her house to her workplace. So choose 3 or 4 of these options, A to J, and create something that Lisa will take from her house to her workplace. So you only have 3 or 4 of these. I know it says 5. Okay. If you want 5, you can have them. All right. 3, 2, 1. So what did you build? Surprise, surprise. There's no right answer, but how many of you built something like this? Or this? Okay, so there's no right answer. In the end, it's about knowing and managing your customers' expectations, understanding what's important as you deliver value to them. So if you take a look at the first scenario, that's more of what we characterize as a waterfall approach. You're really not delivering a means of quote unquote value until the end. You can't really get from A to B with just a wheel, I guess, unless you're one of those folks in my neighborhood, Cambridge, MIT, who actually can hold their balance riding around on one of those things. But the second scenario is more of an agile approach. At the end of really even the first iteration, the customer has a working product. And then you're continuing to iterate on it until the very end. Another way to think about it is, when do you have a usable product available in each example? There you go. And a final construct before we really dig into the definition of Agile is what I like to call the requirements and technology complexity spectrum. So if you think about your project or your business challenge, if your requirements or your problem statement is known and stable, a waterfall approach can be more effective, where you're planning, you're designing, you're building, you're testing, you're deploying. If your requirements are less certain, you may want to consider delivering working increments to generate valuable feedback and increasing your options. And if you have unknown or changing requirements or uncertain means to solve it, then hopefully someone above you can help, because you've got anarchy. All right, so as you hopefully now can appreciate a little bit, Agile is essentially a way to take an iterative approach to development, emphasizing flexibility to hopefully not constantly, but to really always have your scope, the top priority scope, front and center, to ensure that you're meeting the evolving needs of the business. So an agile solution evolves by building and testing with users while adhering to a predefined timeline and budget. While on the other hand, waterfall adheres to strict scope definition, but you're able to deliver to a plan. Value can sometimes take a back seat. So this framework here is highlighting at a very high level the agile life cycle, the core elements of an agile engagement: discovery, sprint cycle, and release. Sprint cycles can be, one or multiple, usually multiple. This is a very rudimentary view. Additional structures and activities are often required based on the context, scope, scale of the engagement. Discovery is where we plan, mobilize the engagement, initiate the product backlog. Here is also where we establish foundational solution architecture, infrastructures. This is usually a 1 to 2 month activity where we're really just standing up the overall program organization. We're going to go into a lot more detail on what a day in the life of all of this looks like in just a bit. So bear with me. Sprint cycles are where we do sprint planning. We deliver working software through daily stand-ups. We accept that working software through daily reviews. We reflect back on it. We deploy to production eventually through the release. What else can I say about this? Really just, again, this framework highlights the core elements, but there's a lot more to it that gets layered in. So think about change management, security and controls, data and integrations. And frankly, before we, run out of time, I'd really be remiss without a word or two on, what goes beyond. So beyond the delivery. So think about training, rollout, support, lessons learned, development, incremental releases. So all of that is not depicted here, but you can think of it as additional layers of the cake underneath. Customer relationships, business development, all of that are almost concentric circles around the agile life cycle, if you will. So what I suppose is hopefully, perhaps a topic for Antonio to think about for the next wave of topics. Consulting is definitely a people business, and how is business developed? It's really the art of relationships, and through being shoulder to shoulder and being in the weeds together through this whole process, these are how you really get to understand in a very intimate way the challenges that your client is facing. I think it is through the discovery process, through the feedback loops, through the intimacy that you foster with your customers, with your users. I think this is really where the future opportunities come out. So I think it is a very successful way to uncover some of that potential that you can use to foster the beyond aspects of your consultancy. So next, I just wanted to touch on the team. So you'll hear a term, Scrum team. This is the phrase used to characterize the team within an agile project. So I like to think of the Scrum team as really the heart and the heroics of an agile organization. And I just wanted to show where a Scrum team fits in within a broader program. This is just an example. So a Scrum team, as you can see, is literally in the center of it all, and it's typically comprised of several talented individuals, including what's known as, first and foremost, Scrum Master, another fancy word. Scrum Master you can think of as a servant leader who ensures that the team is fully functional and productive, and really literally facilitates the team's success. And then also within the Scrum team is other members of the overall development team. So this is, again, a multi-talented group of people. including user experience designers, visual designers, front-end developers, back-end developers, data engineers, quality engineers, or testers. And then of mention, because we're going to talk a lot about this role, is that of the product owner. Think of the product owner as really the voice of the customer. The product owner represents clients and stakeholders. It's critical that they be experienced, empowered, influential, and committed to the success of the product. Not represented on this slide, but outside of the project organization, there very well may be codependent projects or systems that could have a huge bearing on the agile execution. So again, recall that very simple diagram on the slide we just looked at. It may have a bearing on how many sprints you have, the duration of the sprints, how many sprints you can undertake before you're able to go live into production. Codependent systems or projects, integrations between them, all could have a bearing on some of those milestones or decisions. Okay, so without further ado, we're just going to start to do a double click into some of the phases that we looked at in the Agile lifecycle. So just a bit more on discovery before we get into some of the nitty gritty on, what really goes on under the covers. So, we mentioned that the discovery phase is typically 1 to 2 months. So why is that? Why is it so important to make sure we take a little bit of time to set ourselves up for success? There really is a lot that goes on in those critical phases. Some call it, a sprint zero. The bottom line is this process that you're seeing on this page, where you're identifying all the components of what's necessary to get off on the right foot with your sprints. It works. The key is doing all the heavy lifting prior to writing your user stories. We're going to get to what a user story is in a sec. It's just a requirement. The key is to do all the work that's required to ensure that your user stories or your requirements don't need to be reworked, and training the Scrum team on what the user story, what it is, what it's all about. Because very often as a consultant, you'll come in to your clients and they'll be like, WTF is a user story. I've never heard this word before. I'm used to writing my, my requirements. Here they are. Go and build it and come talk to me when it's done. But it's critical to bring them along in the journey so that they are all marching to the same beat, so to speak. So what you're seeing on this slide is really an overview of the steps necessary to get ready to sprint. So simply during, again, sprint zero, you're just preparing to write user stories in order for development to occur. And the product owner plays a key role. So let's talk for a moment about user stories. So just as a guideline, again, I wanted to spend a moment here because of, just how much of a disconnect there is between user stories and a typical, I need this, I need the system to do this, here's a long list, please come and let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to be ready to test when it's ready for testing in a few months. Let me know. So critical to engage the business to work with you in writing user stories, critical to get the business to understand what a user story is and how to write them. So, the product owner, the Scrum team, they don't write the user stories. The user stories have to come from the business, but it's a key role of the consultants, the product owner, to help articulate how to do these. So just a few tips. A user story should be small, such that it can be developed or completed in, let's say, half a sprint. Writing user stories is an art and a science. So there are lots of principles. We won't have time to cover all of these today, but it does take practice. It takes even more practice to get user stories right-sized or small enough. It takes input from the Scrum team or the developers, right? Because, how would let's say a business person necessarily know if a user story can be developed in half a sprint? We also have to put constraints around a user story. So these could be technical constraints or other acceptance criteria you'll hear in the industry. So certain conditions that also help with, let's say, defining test criteria around whether the user story is proven to be developed correctly, let's say. So all of these conditions around the requirement go into the development stage or the sprint. And together, all of this information meets another industry term called the definition of ready, DOR, another TLA. So essentially the discovery phase, the product owner is helping to guide the business and the team to define a set of priority user stories that begin to build up what's known as a product backlog. And it starts through a process of prioritization and estimation and sizing meaning, how big is the story? How long might it take to develop? They start to form a MVP, minimum viable product, which if you can think of, let's say, just visually allocating the user stories across a series of sprints to form a minimum viable product, that will become your release plan. Now, this is a lot to digest. So let's take a look at what can this look like in an actual agile execution. So we already learned about the key players. So we've got our dream team, the product owner, the Scrum team. We learned about the definition of ready. There's also a definition of done. We're not going to get into that too much, but it is the opposing term. We learned about user stories and the importance of them meeting the definition of ready. So we talked about, during discovery, the user stories are prioritized, estimated, and sized. We talked about the solution architecture being defined. The product roadmap starts to become established. Again, this is an ongoing process of continuous refinement. But the roadmap is established, as is a minimum viable product release plan. The definition of done is defined. A testing strategy is defined. Project tools are configured. So one tool you might hear of is Jira. That's an agile management tool. But essentially here, the team is ready to start sprinting. So here comes, sprint one. The Scrum team basically goes through or is ready to begin a series of communication cadences or ceremonies I mentioned a bit earlier, starting with a very important process called sprint planning. So in the sprint, the Scrum team is essentially iteratively developing the product in small deployable increments, and it becomes increasingly efficient. It tests its quality through feedback and improvement loops. And every day, the team has a daily stand-up. What are you doing today? What's in your way? Do you need any help? So these daily stand-ups are rapid 15-minute meetings. There are also sprint demos that happen at the end of each sprint, where the product is basically demoed to stakeholders. Feedback is given and may be captured for the next sprint, or otherwise the product is accepted by the product owner or other stakeholders. A retrospective is also held at the end of each sprint. What did you learn? What's going on? What can we capture? What can we do better? All of this is continuously logged and put in the backlog. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a priority for the immediate sprint. It could be something that's put on for the next release. Scrum of Scrum. So, you remember our slide, the heart and the heroic. Sometimes there are multiple Scrum teams. There could be a couple codependent products being developed in parallel. So you can imagine Agile at scale. If there are parallel Scrum teams working, there will be Scrum of Scrums. Imagine SOS. Save our souls. So yes, this can be a very complex process, but it does work especially when it is as complex, it demands even more rigor. So a common misconception. So as we are, getting ready to release, regression testing is conducted, user acceptance testing is conducted, go, no-go decisions are being made, deployment planning is happening, solution handover is happening, change management and training is happening. And of course, I touched very briefly on the beyond activities, but let's surely keep them in mind. Oh, that was a whirlwind. Let's not forget that consultants love to talk, but hopefully that gives you just a quick glimpse into all that is going on in an Agile execution, if you will. Now, I did want to take a step back because, what does successful delivery look like? I mean, you just saw glimpses of the orchestration, but at an individual level, I did just want to speak to what that can look like for you all, because very often it may surprise you to learn that consultants can often step in and play the role of a product owner or even a Scrum Master. Why? Because of how, I would say, new Agile is in industries, how much of a gap this expertise is within organizations. In my experience, my clients have been really desperate for this kind of skill set. So I just wanted to flash this slide so that you could have a quick view of the characteristics and responsibilities of a good product owner, because I do believe that this group is probably very well positioned, given that you can come with a blend of one, industry and business expertise, and two, the delivery knowledge, in the sense that you know how Agile and delivery works, you have the experience working with IT and offshore delivery, or you at least have the knowledge of how to go and acquire those skills, which your clients may not have the bandwidth or capacity to do. So keep that in mind. If you're looking for your next challenge, please don't hesitate to step into these roles that are very much high in demand, because a good product owner is very hard to find, but very critical to a project's success. And then I just wanted to touch on 2 to 3 very critical responsibilities of the product owner, starting with managing the product backlog. So as the PO, okay, this is a 2-letter acronym, PO. One of your responsibilities is managing the product backlog. So again, that is essentially the prioritized list of requirements. So a prerequisite to building up the backlog is collaborating with the business to solicit requirements and support the writing and prioritizing of the user stories. So prioritization should be done collaboratively so that components that appear less critical but are essential for the system to function are prioritized appropriately. So this is key. So again, it goes back to the intimacy that you would have as a consultant with the developers, with the technical architects. I can't necessarily speak intelligently to this point, but I know from my experience that there are requirements, non-functional requirements, that need to be elevated just as high as, Suzy Q's demand for some business functionality. So as a product owner, it's critical that you elevate non-functional requirements, let's say, just as high as the business's demand for, let's say, a seamless user experience. So I think, being a table pounder for non-functional requirements is just as important as hearing out the business for some of their needs and for some of the end users' needs, for example. So what you also see here is, help in decomposing user stories into the necessary level of detail from, here's more terminology for you, epics, features, and user stories. So those are just more terminologies for level of granularity. Okay, moving on to the second responsibility I wanted to highlight that can make you successful is managing multiple stakeholder relationships. So to successfully build great products, the Agile product owner must manage relationships. So we talked about the Scrum team being made up of 3 core roles: product owner, Scrum master, and the team. So you can see here just how much of a critical link the product owner is. And I think without an effective product owner, the team can be unclear on the requirements and the priorities. And the whole thing can just be a big mumbo jumbo for everyone involved. And I just wanted to call out that there is also a role for a project manager. Traditional Scrum teams do not have a project manager as frequently used in waterfall to direct work. Traditional project manager roles are absorbed among the team members, but at times a PM may be assigned to an Agile project to manage some of the needs. So, again, just something to keep in mind in the context of the complexity and the scope of a particular project. And then finally, one more thing to call out to be successful as a PO: change management. The Agile mindset pushes for flexibility, but that does not mean that you can change requirements at any time. I mean, imagine if the business comes one day and says, this is the most important requirement, and then the next day, changes their mind. So again, I think it's a fine line that the product owner, needs to manage. There are different types of change, some that are good and, some that are risky. And I think it's a subtle line that the product owner plays an important role in managing, and, fair enough, may need some coaching from the team or the business, especially when those requests start to fall on the risky side. So, I'll leave you with this slide in terms of critical success factors, but just a few things to keep in mind for success as a PO. I mean, definitely adopt the Agile mindset, thinking iteratively, honing your responsibilities, not just owning the backlog, but what we talked about in terms of change management and relationships too. And embracing those Agile ceremonies or the meetings. I mean, the rigor deserves some respect. It's not only there for the sake of taking up the calendar. The discipline is necessary, especially as the complexity of your project grows. And I will fly through these slides just in the interest of time, but just a quick word on global complexity. This is not necessarily in the context of, oh, I have a global client, it's going to be tough. But, as you think about, not just in the current times of, COVID and everybody's working remotely and, different time zones, but oftentimes with delivery, you have onshore, nearshore, offshore delivery teams. And Agile especially becomes difficult with geographical distance. I think these stats really say it all. And I would bet 9 times out of 10, in this day and age, you're going to have some component of offshore delivery. One of my most privileged experiences was working with our offshore delivery teams in India, and some of my lessons learned and successes that I would share with you are here on the slide, and I will invite you to digest those when Simon and Antonio share the slide with you. But it boils down to one team, one goal. You do not want to throw the user stories over the wall. Here you go, dev team, have fun sprinting on these. But I think, you know, the Agile ceremonies really force that in terms of ensuring that the teams are connected. I think involving the teams in the process as much as possible really helps. But having shared context, setting ground rules, FaceTime, using the Agile tools, and really making sure that you have the right butts in the seats in terms of the teams and the roles and responsibilities, the right men and women and people for the job, can certainly go a long way. And last but not least, how to measure. We wouldn't have anything if we couldn't measure it. But essentially, you know, one key principle of Agile is keep it simple. We do not over-index on having 1,000 KPIs, but we like to have a few basics around schedule, scope, effort, and budget. So we don't like to throw away, you know, the tried and true. So we do consider traditional project health metrics that you would always have in any given project, waterfall or not. But there are some specific Agile metrics that I'll flash in a sec. But I'd be remiss without a word on good old-fashioned, you know, quality development indicators, coverage, defects, and the like. So could write a whole book on some of this. Don't let it come back to bite you in the butt. Have a conversation about what code quality looks like, whether you're developing an MVP or something that's going into production very soon. So take this to heart on day one, not on the day before go live. Here are just a handful of Agile metrics that you can think about or expect to see if you do adopt an Agile project. Very typical ways of measuring your velocity, your efficiency, how much work you're actually getting done. But again, the idea is not to measure everything, but what you can actually expect to get some value out of. So that's all I had to share with you. I hope no one is asleep. I'm happy to take any questions or continue the conversation on LinkedIn. That's you, great. Everyone.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Yes, we are running late, but as one or two people have said, it's been really interesting content. And there's one or two people who think they can now do Agile without having to go on a training course. So maybe that's a little bit over optimistic. I think I'll just voice it on his behalf. One of the more interesting questions that came up was from Tim Denvere, who was questioning the dichotomy, as he puts it, between Agile and a high degree of quality management. So, for example, if we were talking about the in-flight systems that are keeping your aircraft up in the air when you're flying across the Atlantic, do you actually need a different approach to delivery, or is Agile still the answer?
Oh, totally. Oh, gosh. Yes. I'm sure you've heard of like Wagile or blended Agile. There's all sorts of even like bastardized, let's say, versions of the methodology. Simon, if you take offense to that term, feel free to delete it. But indeed, so I've seen organizations adopt Agile to their specific organizational context. For example, exactly to the point, you know, if you're sunsetting legacy applications, that may require, let's say, you have your discovery, you have You may need 7 or 9 sprints. And after a point, your Scrum team might be like, are we really Agile, or are we having an extended, development cycle that just is called Agile? But in the case of one program I delivered, we had our 6 sprints, but then we deployed into a higher environment. And then we had to have an extended user acceptance testing because of just the high degree of integration with the client's very complex SAP, environment. And it took a while to really prove out the success of the product before the client was comfortable deploying to production finally. Or maybe it's not even the systems that are that hairy, but rather the end user adoption or the change management that needs some finesse. So it wasn't even a systems aspect, but rather they just needed time to get the end users ready to, take over or embrace the product. So there are many ways to, I think, tailor an agile method for the organization. And I think it's really important to have that conversation and acknowledgement up front, really during the discovery phase, to understand what it is and what it isn't. I think there are ways to embrace certain aspects of Agile and maybe over-index on some and tailor others to your needs. Yeah.
So thank you again, Jackie. That was fantastic. The amount of detail there was stunning. Delighted with people's responses to that. They were very, very complimentary. And thank you to Francis and Alan also for the earlier talks. It's been a really good last session. And I suppose with 22 minutes past our official finish time, it's one of those things where, you just want another encore, don't you? But I think not, I'm afraid. So let's call it a day. That's a season wrap for How to Be a Consultant. Thank you all for joining us. And there will be other exciting and interesting talks from the Consultancy Specialist Group. So stay tuned and join us again. Thank you. You may disconnect. Thank you.